In this video, we're going to talk about a new way to make graphs using an R package called ggplot. We've previously used a function from ggplot called qplot to make graphs. However, qplot has been deprecated, which means that the ggplot developers would like to get rid of it in the future, and they're encouraging us to move to the original method of making graphs using ggplot, which you can see on the right. It turns out that qplot uses this code behind the scenes to create graphs when you call it. So really all we're doing is learning how to make graphs the underlying way. In fact, you can see that both graphs here, one created with qplot and one created with other functions, look the same at the end. In particular, we're going to use a function called ggplot, which is where the ggplot2 package gets its name from, along with functions like this, geom_histogram, to create graphs in the future. Although the code that we have to write is a little bit longer, it's much more powerful and allows us to do a lot more than just using the qplot function. So the ggplot package is based on the idea that every graph can be described using a common set of words, which it calls a grammar. And the way we combine these words together allows us to build up a graph as a series of layers and sometimes transformations. So ggplot, the function ggplot that we saw a couple of slides ago, creates a layer in your graph. We have some code up here with just the ggplot function and a data frame that we're supplying to the data argument. And when we run this, we get a blank gray canvas because the ggplot function by itself just creates the canvas on which we can draw our graph. To add actual information to our graph, we have to add other functions which add those extra layers. Typically, the functions we'll be adding are what are called geom functions. Geom stands for geometry, and this is how we add shapes to our graph. We add them to ggplot using the addition operator, the plus symbol, like you can see here. So we have the ggplot function, the closing bracket of the ggplot function, then the plus operator, and then a geom function like geom_histogram. So two separate functions which we're adding together. So geom_histogram creates a histogram, but there are a variety of different geom functions, all of which are spelled geom_something. Within a geom function, we have to do something called an aesthetic mapping, which is a fancy way of saying how do we tell ggplot how to convert our data in our data frame into a shape. In other words, we're mapping columns from the data frame to particular shapes or appearances of the graph, which are what are called aesthetics. So every geom function will have this mapping argument, like we can see here in the geom_histogram function. And what we supply to that is a function called AES, which stands for aesthetic. And inside the aesthetic function, we specify how columns of the data frame, like age, are mapped to different parts of the graph, like the x-axis. Just as with the qplot function, we need to say what column do we want to put on the x-axis. We also have parts of the graph that we might want to customize, parts of the geom functions layer, where that customization is not based on a column of the data frame. So for example, we might want to change the number of bins in our histogram. Here, for example, we've set bins to be equal to 15. However, 15 is not a column of the heart disease data frame. It's just a value that we've picked. So this bins argument is actually an argument of the geom_histogram function. It does not go inside the aesthetic function because it's not an aesthetic mapping of a column of data to an aesthetic of the layout.